When National Geographic Explorer at Large, Dr. Robert Ballard, discovered the wreck of the RMS Titanic in 1985.
Look at that thing!
That is big. It's a foil! This sucker exists!
He opened a new chapter in a page-turner we haven't been able to put down for over 100 years. The ship of dreams rests on the ocean floor, but she still trails a wake of speculation and intrigue. The latest is an international tug-of-war over the fate of a huge collection of artifacts, belongings, the last lifelines to the souls lost with the ship.
When they found Isidore's body, they found a locket with the initials Isidore Strauss. This is the most precious item in my life.
But the story is even larger than the future of these priceless possessions.
The fate of the artifacts that have been brought up is now uncertain. But also the fate of the Titanic that's still on the bottom of the ocean is uncertain now. I'll never forget seeing the Titanic for the first time. It's pitch black. And you don't see it until the last minute. It's as if someone pulls back the curtain. It comes out of this black velvet void of nothingness.
Get out. Does Kathy got the champagne? So we're out. Everybody out of the rack.
There were two people inside of me at that moment. The professional, who was elated and happy and excited. Then there was the human inside of me. There was exact opposite feeling, a sense of remorse, a sense of, we shouldn't be celebrating anything. We're at the spot where this amazing tragedy, this amazing drama had unfolded.
Everyone just crashed. Emotionally, everyone just went down a big trough.
It was an identical night, moonless night, stars in the sky.
And we had a simple, quiet service on the fantail. We felt better. And it was that time I realized that I was deeply affected by it.
Pretty powerful, yeah. To this day. Yeah, pretty powerful. It's not so much the ship, it's the spot where you're at. The ground speaks.
What started as an objective scientific expedition had become an emotional connection to 1,500 lost souls.
And when you find the Titanic, you know exactly what took place right where you are. And that's eerie. I mean, you want to see lifeboats or people in the water that you can take out of the water because they drowned right around you. Yeah, you hear them. You feel it, very much so.
In this deep-sea tomb, the most common items take on uncommon significance.
Nestled amongst all of that debris, I saw shoes, the pairs of shoes that were the final remnants of those who perished and without life jackets fell to the bottom, being removed by the animals that lived there, exposing their skeletons that then were dissolved by the cold Antarctic bottom water, undersaturated in calcium carbonate. But left behind were their shoes in the exact position they were onto their bodies.
And action.
National Geographic Explorer at Large and award-winning film director James Cameron shares Ballard's wonder at the remnants of lost lives.
And we came across a pair of women's shoes next to a pair of girls' shoes. These were people.
These were people. Those shoes got to the bottom
double
on people.
And there was a hand mirror next to them.
Yeah.
And a comb. So I could imagine her holding the mirror as her mother combed her hair.
This is the human element. This is what people touched. It's what they lived with.
Amazing.
And we came in on the debris field right through
When
here.
Ballard and his team discovered Titanic, their first thought was to protect it by taking ownership of the wreck.
I went into the courts and I asked for a judgment. I said, I found it. Can I own it? And they said yes, because it was an abandoned shipwreck and was on the high seas. And the Admiralty law, written in the 17th century, was sort of finders keepers. But under one condition, you have to salvage it. Pick up a teacup or something.
But it wouldn't have been just one teacup. Under that 500-year-old law, to retain ownership, Ballard would have had to go down every few years and salvage more artifacts.
And I said, I don't want to salvage it. It's like going to Gettysburg with a shovel. You don't do that. This is a graveyard.
But a company called RMS Titanic Incorporated and its parent company, Premier Exhibitions, had a different philosophy.
They recovered artifacts. They brought those before a judge, and the judge made them salvor in possession. That not only gave them the legal right to go back and recover things, it obligated them to go back and recover things.
When you go to any site, whether it's a land site or an underwater site, your first job is to try and preserve those objects. You will become then the steward of those objects.
RMS Titanic, Premier have been keeping up with International Museum standards in the care and the curation of the collection.
In the ensuing decades, RMS Titanic has legally salvaged and curated more than 5,500 items from the ship's debris field.
The inventory of the artifacts runs the gamut. Now, most of what was brought up, except for the big piece of the Titanic, are small items. A lot of dishes and porcelain. See, porcelain, China, doesn't deteriorate. It looks like it was made a minute ago. But they also did bring up clothing, other personal items, but leather. Leather does survive.
Here is a shoe. Made of leather, of course. This was a man's shoe. We don't know the owner of this particular shoe, but it's one of perhaps 10 or so shoes that we have, all of which came from inside leather cases. It's our job to take care of the artifacts that have been recovered so that they can continue to tell the story of Titanic and the people who had them and the people who used them, so that we can continue to remember that legacy.
I found the curator, Alex Klingelhofer, to be very respectful, not only of the artifacts, but of the stories they represent, and in some cases, as something left behind by people whose identity is known.
RMS Titanic has shared the collection with Titanic aficionados around the world in a traveling exhibit.
The question of the Titanic exhibitions has been a controversial one since the first exhibit. But for those who have gone to see the exhibits, what they have seen is something that very much connects them to Titanic.
But RMS Titanic Inc.'s parent company, Premier Exhibitions, recently emerged from bankruptcy and changed hands. Now, the collection could be auctioned off.
What happens to the artifacts right now is anyone's guess.
This massive catalog, containing everything from a 15-ton piece of the hull to china from the first-class dining room, is in danger of sinking forever from public view. The future of thousands of belongings recovered from the Titanic wreck, valued at $20 million, is currently in limbo. While Premier Exhibitions was in bankruptcy court, two groups vied for control of its catalog: a coalition of British museums and a group of Premier's shareholders and other investors. The Museum Coalition's plan was to bring the collection home to Belfast, Titanic's birthplace.
Well, the Titanic story begins in Belfast. This was a community of shipbuilders and built some of the greatest ships of all.
A century ago, this dry dock was the largest on the planet, built for an epic new class of ocean liner. Here, tens of thousands constructed the most massive moving objects ever built.
Well, this is where it all began. I mean, this is where the Titanic was built. She went on her maiden voyage, and we want to finish that voyage and bring the artifacts home.
We have to try and intervene here. This is the one opportunity to make sure that the right thing is done. And this collection is not just preserved as a collection, but is brought into public ownership so that it will remain here in perpetuity for generations to enjoy, and thus protected for all time.
In the court's most recent decision, they allowed the collection to remain with the Premier Exhibition's shareholders.
We have no idea what the primary stockholders, Premier Titanic, are gonna do. We have our fears.
Some worry they may sell all or part of the collection to a Titanic theme park being constructed in China.
There's concern that the artifacts could be taken to China, and there, beyond the reach of U.S. law, they could be sold. Or they could also be held together. No one knows for sure, but therein lies a concern that some have expressed.
While the battle over the item's fate played out in the public eye, Bob Ballard believes their real value is in the hearts of their owners' descendants, especially in Belfast, Titanic's birthplace, at this dock.
At the end of that dock, I saw this wall of steel, and it just reminded me of the moment I saw the Titanic. And it was a flashback to the moment of discovery. This was built with the same steel, the same rivets. That's the side of the Titanic. This is the first thing I saw, the side of the ship. It was just monumental because you can't see very far under the ocean. And so you're exploring this vast part of our planet with a flashlight. And so you're shining your flashlight, and then all of a sudden, something comes into view. That really speaks to me, more so than anything.
But rivets and steel are only part of Titanic's story. Ballard wants to hear the rest directly from the families of her passengers and crew. To track them down, he uses an international network of researchers, including a Titanic buff who collects more than artifacts. He collects passengers.
I have all 2,208 people that were on Titanic listed in here. Their birth certificates, their death certificates, their wills, their immigration papers, passports.
Phil Gowan's interest in the Titanic began at an early age.
I can remember very clearly my mother saying, "That boat sank 50 or 60 years ago. Why do you care about it now?" I guess I wanted to know what caused certain people to survive and others to lose their lives.
Deep in Gowan's research is information on the workmen charged with making sure the Titanic's maiden voyage went smoothly. Like Artie Frost, a master fitter on the ship, his grandson Ian Frost still treasures the tools of his grandpa's trade.
And this whistle was a most useful thing to have. If you wanted to draw somebody's attention to the fact you wanted to speak to them, you used the whistle because they wouldn't have heard you if you shouted. Still works. Can I use it? It won't blow anything.
In 1912, Artie Frost was delighted to get word he'd been chosen to sail on Titanic's first journey.
An awful lot of the employees would have loved to have gone.
Artie shared the good news with his family in this postcard his grandson prizes.
This is the postcard my grandfather, Artie Frost, sent to my father, Stanley, just before he got on the Titanic at Southampton and sailed away. It says, "How would you like to be fishing off this pier?" And that's a picture of the pier at Southampton where the Titanic was tied up. This was the last word the family had from this card, and they never heard from him again. And that does something to me when I say that, isn't it? Yeah.
Artie Frost was last seen in the Titanic's engine room, likely fighting to keep the lights on so more passengers could escape. The fact that his body was never found indicates he didn't try to get into a lifeboat or save himself.
These are a number of calling cards.
In many ways, these artifacts are a portal, not into the past, but to past lives. And whether it's a trunk that, unpacked, offers a variety of things, including correspondence or postcards. In all these ways, they powerfully speak to individuals seemingly forever silenced on that cold, dark night in April 1912.
The Titanic story is straight out of Central Casting. It has all of these elements, the Edwardian era, the wealthy that were aboard. They were the rock stars back then. So you had a ship with the rock stars on it. You had it on a maiden voyage. You had the largest moving object on Earth moving through the ocean. You had this sense of invincibility.
RMS Titanic was dubbed the Ship of Dreams, a floating palace, and most remarkable of all, unsinkable. All 2,220 passengers and crew were on board when Titanic left Queenstown, Ireland on April 11, 1912. They expected to reach New York in 6 days. But just 3 days later, on April 14th, Titanic was steaming at 22 knots on a quiet Sunday night when the silence was interrupted by a terrifying sound.
Iceberg, right ahead!
The Titanic struck an iceberg in the dark reaches of the North Atlantic, off the coast of Newfoundland. Soon, the outside world, including the loved ones of passengers and crew, got their first clue. Titanic was in danger.
You had the wireless for the first time on some of these ships, and they began to get word that something was up.
The greatest ship on the ocean was sending out distress calls.
People couldn't believe their ears. They thought, no, this has got to be a mistake. Surely that ship couldn't sink.
In Titanic's hometown, families of those on board waited anxiously for word.
Rumours in Belfast were rife at the time, and my grandmother must have been a very worried person because she had heard the Titanic had sank. She had also heard that the Titanic had been towed into port without loss of life, and she didn't know for 3 or 4 days whether her husband was alive or dead.
About 700 souls were loaded into lifeboats and rescued by the nearby ship Carpathia. The 1,500 left behind plummeted to a grave site over 2 miles under the sea. Since Bob Ballard's discovery of the wreck, it's been hard for others to resist seeing and touching it for themselves, and that has cost the ship dearly. In the years since the Titanic wreck was found, salvage expeditions have removed artifacts from the debris field, and the tourist trade has compromised the ship itself. It costs upwards of $150,000 for a week-long excursion to the shipwreck.
There's still attempts to do tours to the Titanic. I'm sure it'll continue because the technology is getting easier and easier to do it.
But with each visit, the Titanic pays a price.
They're right there. See those big orange? That's where the submarines have been landing. And you can see it's breaking down the deck. It's crushing it. When you see orange, that's a freshly exposed surface. And that's not natural. That's being done by the people coming and loving the thing to death.
With no international agreements in place to protect the ship, Ballard sees dramatic changes since 1985.
The Titanic is becoming a junkyard. You see big piles of chain and big bags, and there's a lot of trash down there. Up here, we're now going up, traversing the mast, and when we found it, it had a crow's nest.
In Ballard's first dives, he filmed the crow's nest where 25-year-old lookout Frederick Fleet spotted the iceberg that doomed the Titanic. Now, that iconic piece of history is gone. And with it goes a striking symbol of the Titanic's demise and a memorial to the lookout's effort to save the ship from disaster.
It's really sad when I look at the damage that's been done by the submarines. We, in many ways, opened Pandora's box.
But thanks to the things some left behind, the stories of those on the ill-fated ship survive in the memories of their descendants. Like the granddaughter of the unsinkable Molly Brown.
Margaret Brown, Molly Brown, as the world knows her, was obviously quite a character.
She was larger than life.
Molly helped load people into lifeboats and kept up morale as they rowed to the Carpathia.
She was intelligent. She had like that emotional intelligence to read the situations, and I really liked that.
Molly Brown survived the shipwreck, but her belongings, worth over $500,000 in today's money, sank to the ocean floor. This necklace, retrieved by RMS Titanic, may have belonged to her. The company also recovered jewelry from other passengers, all artifacts now in jeopardy.
We found all of the high-end jewelry in a Gladstone bag, which is what the pursers would have used. In it was a lot of currency and several rings. This is one of them.
When you see something like that in a lab or on a display, it's powerful. It connects you to these people. And as an archaeologist, what compels me is how artifacts tied to people give voice to them and give us insight into their lives and to who they were.
Personal effects weren't the only last vestiges of those lost. The ship's builders had their life's work sink to the ocean floor. This is the office of Thomas Andrews, the man who oversaw the construction of the Titanic at the world-renowned Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast.
He's the architect. He's the most qualified person, the most knowledgeable person about the Titanic. I have the greatest respect for him. To actually be in his room in Belfast at Harland Wolff is pretty special. Pretty special. I can imagine him standing here, fire burning, pondering the plans, seeing something that's wrong and correcting something. Probably had a pen right here and made his notes and rolled them up and carried him across the hall.
Thomas was a rising star in charge of designing new ocean liners.
Everybody loved Thomas Andrews. They called him Tommy. He was a very personable man. He would walk around in the shipyard, he would talk to the workers, and he would actually listen to them and try to do something for them.
Bob Ballard is piecing together Andrews' story with the help of the Belfast Titanic Society. He's come to the village of Cobbard, Andrews' hometown, to meet with his grandnephew, John Andrews.
When you look at the state of the technology of shipbuilding, it was really the cutting edge.
Yeah, it was at the pinnacle of technology at the peak of the British Empire. It was an exciting time, and Belfast was at the forefront of all that.
I can only guess what Thomas Andrews might have felt when they first stepped aboard, but satisfaction is what it had to be, because nothing had ever been like this before, and the fact that it had been conceived, drafted, constructed, and now it was a finished product had to be the ultimate climax for their lives at that point.
And we're now celebrating the great achievement, not just by one man,
right,
Uncle Tommy, but by all his workmates.
When they hit the iceberg, Captain Smith summoned Thomas Andrews. captain asked him to go below decks and assess the damage to the ship, which he knew so well. And he went below decks and walked the compartments and returned to the bridge and told the captain it was going to sink.
According to survivors, Thomas Andrews, like many other crew members, put the passengers first on that terrible night.
Thomas Andrews was, trying to assist in getting life jackets out. For his testimony that, that he told one woman, here's your life jacket, take it and go.
He didn't heed his own advice.
Thomas Andrews was seen in the first-class smoking room towards the end. He was standing beside a big painting that was above the fireplace, and he was staring out into the distance.
He gave up his life. He didn't even bother to put on a life jacket. He didn't even bother to go up to the boat deck. He was last seen admiring his ship and went down with her.
Andrews' body was lost, like those of hundreds of others.
This is not the story of a ship. This is the story of a small community that, for the most part, died in the course of a single night.
As early as 1912, families of the victims proposed expeditions to locate the wreckage. Yet even as deep-sea technology improved, the Titanic remained beyond reach until Bob Ballard hit a perfect storm of research and luck, including a clue from a Titanic survivor. When Bob Ballard set out to find Titanic, he was searching for an historic ship. He didn't realize he was embarking on an emotional journey. But even the crucial clue that helped him find it came from the moving story of one of the survivors, passenger Jack Thayer. At the pier in New York, where passengers came ashore, Ballard meets Thayer's grandson. Jack was one of the last people to jump from the stern of the Titanic and live.
He and a friend jumped from the same rail at the same time. His friend didn't survive, he did. So it was just probably by sheer luck. And by finding an overturned lifeboat and having some place to sort of call home for the night, he was able to get out of the water directly.
Jack's account was one of the first to say the Titanic broke in half as it sank.
He said the rumble and the roar continued with even louder, distinct wrenching and tearing of boilers and engines from their beds. Suddenly, the whole superstructure of the ship appeared to split. That's what led me to realize that the ship broke in half and dumped out its contents. The story he told gave me an idea on how to find her, and that was not to look for the Titanic, but I would look for the debris that came off the Titanic, because I knew its footprint would be much larger and predictable. We knew the currents, so we knew the debris field should be north-south, and that's huge, because now I have a line this way, I search this way. And sure enough, I picked up the footprints, and it led me to the Titanic.
It was the moment so many Titanic enthusiasts had awaited for so long. Ballard's images from the deep told the story they could only imagine. But for some, it wasn't enough. Like the dedicated collectors who frequent this biannual auction in a small town in the English countryside.
We are the world's leaders in the sale of Titanic memorabilia. We have sold hundreds and hundreds of items. We hold every world record relating to the sale of Titanic memorabilia.
These are not items salvaged by RMS Titanic. In fact, none were taken from the ocean floor. They came from the ship and the people who built her before she sailed. But they attract bidders anyway. People determined to hold a piece of the legendary ship in their very own hands.
I'm an engineer by trade, so I'm interested in mechanical and how the ship works.
Of the things I collect, I think the things that interest me pertain to people.
These bidders trade their personal riches for the Titanic's treasures.
These tiles will cost £300 or £400. Something like this will be worth between £3,000 and £5,000. This card was posted from the Titanic, so this card is worth several £1,000s.
One of the most anticipated items at today's auction is this set of keys from a first-class men's lavatory.
And what's significant about these? They're from the Titanic, so they're worth between £30,000 and £50,000.
Have a look at the large plate.
This is where collectors put a price tag on the pleasure of owning a piece of Titanic's history.
We have phone bids registered from around the world. We got bidders from the US, bidders from China, bidders from Thailand.
I particularly collect menus.
China is my main interest. I've always collected in China.
This is a young man, Johnny Kelly. He was a worker at Harland and Wolff. He was one of the first men to die on Titanic. He died in June 1910. He fell from a gantry, age 19, almost 2 years before she sank beneath the North Atlantic.
They've got some fantastic stuff in the auction, one-off things which will probably never appear again, and I suspect items like that will just go through the roof.
Got my menus. Yes, and a menu holder. So that's good. I'm happy.
As the Titanic auction concludes, net sales add up to over $300,000. The men's room keys sell for more than $55,000. 2 letters of condolence to grieving families go for more than $700 each. Some of the items in the auction are bound for museums, but others will disappear from public view. This is what Bob Ballard fears will happen to the RMS Titanic collection if it's auctioned off. He's concerned we will lose the personal stories, like this from a second-class passenger.
2 of them here. This one, as you can see, is a declaration of intention, and that means that Franz Pohlbaum, who was 27 years old and a machinist, wanted to become a U.S. citizen.
He carries that with him as well as everything else he owns. His work clothes, his tools, his German-English dictionary.
Franz Pohlbaum would never have the chance to use them.
There were a certain number of people who were on that ship because they were coming here to start a new life, to be part of the American dream. An American dream that Franz Pohlbaum ultimately would not be able to achieve.
Discovering stories like Pohlbaum's keep the Titanic drama unfolding today, but recovering personal possessions like his ignite an impassioned debate.
There are basic philosophical questions. Should you or I or anybody else have the right to purchase one individual thing? Should we have the right to purchase it all and keep it to ourselves?
The Titanic is really a deep-sea museum with the doors wide open. There's no lock on the door and there's no guard.
Dr. Bob Ballard is concerned about the future of the storied shipwreck he discovered.
If the Titanic is not protected, it'll get stripped. It'll get stripped until all the jewels have been taken off the old lady's body.
Alongside Ballard, James Cameron has also been a special hero to this grand old lady and the artifacts that adorn her.
I wanted to dive the wreck more than I wanted to make the movie. Diving the wreck was my way into this story.
As a National Geographic explorer at large and noted film director, Titanic brings together Cameron's 2 loves.
We come to that shot of the stem, the vertical bow, and then we transition into 1912 and we crane up over it and we see the whole ship.
Cameron's 1997 movie is a portal to the true stories told by passengers' families.
Hi, Paul.
Is the great-grandson of Isidore and Ida Strauss.
I know their story well.
Paul Kurzman is the descendant of a legendary couple lost with the ship.
Isidore Strauss was a self-made millionaire and a former congressman. He and his wife, Ida, chose to die together on the Titanic.
The story, as you know so well, is that she got into a lifeboat, women and children did, and expected her husband Isidore to follow.
To come in, yeah.
And he said, I will not enter a lifeboat until I see that all the women and children on board are in lifeboats. We will be on the ship together as it goes down. We will die as we have lived together. When they found Isidore's body, they found a locket with the initials Isidore Strauss. Here is a picture of their eldest son, Jesse, and here's a picture of their eldest daughter, Sarah.
Grandmother.
My grandmother.
Your grandmother. So that's what he kept close to his heart.
And this is the most precious item in my life.
That's powerful. It's powerful.
For archaeologist Dr. James Delgado, the Strausses' heartbreaking love story hit home when he first dived the wreck.
Moving along and said, lifeboat 8, and then you go, lifeboat 8? Because that's where the Strausses were. You're looking right at that spot, where they stood, where they chose to walk away together and die together because they loved each other. And that was the first time. That was the first time I cried on Titanic.
James Cameron also continues to seek out the moments of connection with those on the ship, working with his team of what some members fondly call Titaniacs. Bill Sauter is the former director of research for the RMS Titanic Inc.'s collection of artifacts. The same collection, recently in bankruptcy court.
The one thing I'll remember about Titanic artifacts to the day I die is when the Saalfeld perfume vials came up.
Adolf Saalfeld was a perfume merchant traveling in first class. He survived the shipwreck, but his perfume vials sank inside his satchel.
When you recover stuff from the Titanic, it's wet, it's rusty, and it's rotten. And the smell that comes off it is perfectly alien, perfectly fetid. You know it's a kind of death you have never experienced. And so the lab is kind of unpleasant. And then all of a sudden, somebody opens up this satchel, this leather satchel, and out comes the fragrance of heaven. It's all these flowers and fruity flavors, and it's delicious. It's the most wonderful thing you've ever had. It was just a complete, overwhelming experience. It was like all of a sudden the fragrance of heaven, you know, kind of goes through the room. So instead of being surrounded by all of these dead things, for those few minutes, the ship was alive again.
Artifacts are the window into life on the Titanic, telling the stories of the passengers and crew.
Artifacts, in particular, are more than a scientific term, artifact. They're real things, they're mementos, and it commands a necessary respect of what this means to people, particularly families and descendants, but also anybody who cares.
The jewelry, clothing, and other effects in the RMS Titanic exhibits have fascinated and moved audiences around the world. But since these salvaged artifacts now won't be held in the public trust by museums, will they be auctioned off to private buyers and disappear from view?
The two things you've got to be watching is, are they kept together and never sold? Can they be made available for public exhibitry and not disappear into private collections and be lost? I don't know the outcome. I don't know what the final chapter is.
Although thousands of artifacts have been recovered from the Titanic's debris field, there are still many more inside the cabins and compartments.
Some 5,500 artifacts have been recovered. Those, in reality, while a large collection, represent less than 1% of everything that would have been in Titanic or that would be left in and around Titanic as an archaeological site.
The salvagers have been going after what shook out of it like a salt shaker at the break, but there are tens of thousands inside, and that's what's at peril, because you can now get in. The technology of getting in is there.
Bob Ballard believes the same remotely operated underwater vehicles, ROVs, that make it easier to get inside the Titanic could also make it easier to police it, keeping illegal treasure hunters away.
Do I expect others to go after artifacts from the Titanic covertly or quietly? Yes. Now, is there technology that we could build sentries? Absolutely. Could we have guards? Yes, easily.
He also suggests the idea of making Titanic and other historic wrecks into museums or tourist destinations, controlled and maintained by experts. Thanks to a technology he's helped pioneer, this could all be done without damaging the ship at all.
Most of our expeditions now don't involve physically going to the bottom of the ocean like I used to do. And when I went to the Titanic, I actually went down in a submarine, landed. We've replaced that with what we call telepresence. And quite honestly, you can stay down much longer. So it's much more cost effective and a lot safer. The technology to turn these places into underwater museums are here and now.
If Titanic were a museum, using virtual reality technology, everyone could visit the Ship of Dreams.
As you move over those silent decks lit up, you can almost imagine people crowding there and thronging and weeping as the boats were loaded and the realization was that there wasn't room for all.
The story of the Titanic will go on in our hearts and imaginations.
Why Titanic remains a story that compels us more than 100 years later is because it is a human story. Any listener, any reader, any viewer can imagine themselves there with the most difficult of choices, whether or not they will live or die, and if they die, how they choose to meet that end. Titanic never really left us, or perhaps we never have left Titanic alone.
It's a tragedy, a mystery, a cautionary tale.
It was a reminder that we are mortal, that we can make mistakes. It was just a classic example of we maybe think ourselves are pretty on top of our game, but you never are.
Ballard believes that warning extends beyond the Titanic to how we preserve other shipwrecks, both found and still undiscovered.
The United Nations estimates there are 3 million shipwrecks going all the way back in time. So the age of exploration is not in our rearview mirror, it's in our future.
The Titanic will always be a star among shipwrecks, with a special part to play.
Titanic, as one of those iconic shipwrecks, represented more than a find. It was a canary in the coal mine for how we as society would deal in the future with sites like that.
And so the world awaits the next chapter in the story of this legendary ship and the fate of its passengers' precious possessions, hoping that it will never truly end.
The future of the Titanic, if done right, can live for a long, long time.